infertile couple that walks into the clinic. The commonest indications, I'm sure you'll agree, which we face, and almost 70 to 80% of patients will fall in these two categories. One is PCOS, where your induction of ovulation and timed intercourse has failed. And the second is, of course, unexplained infertility, where the semen analysis is normal, your tubes are patent, the hormone estimations are normal, and you still don't know why she's getting pregnant. And of course, besides that, you will have your occasional donor inseminations, patients of stage 1 and 2 endometriosis, patients with male factor infertility, where you can get a good harvest of sperms after washing, and so on. Where should you be doing controlled ovarian stimulation with IUI? Now, in unexplained infertility, we have clear indications now. And I've purposely incorporated some slides today morning, because just in February 2020 this year, we have some fantastic ASRM recommendations and guidelines as to how exactly we should go about treating unexplained infertility. And a lot of you would be amazed or shocked to know that we should not be doing gonadotropin stimulation with IUI anymore for patients of unexplained infertility, and we'll see why this is so. So you can see here that if you do 3 months of ovarian stimulation with IUI, you will definitely have a much higher pregnancy rate than which you would have with just expectant management. The logic being that when you do ovarian stimulation, can we remove the other window because I can't read the slides? Ashwini?
Yes, sir.
If you just keep my window and remove the other windows.
So we cannot do that. No.
The main
so you will be able to see others.
Yeah, no, because the slides are getting covered. No, that's all. No problem. It's fine, no problem. So,
okay.
Because once you do ovulation induction and ovarian stimulation, the logic in unexplained infertility is that maybe you have better quality oocytes, you have more oocytes. Maybe you will be correcting subtle defects in ovulatory function and in the luteal phase, which could be the reason for the unexplained infertility. And also by doing a perfect timing and washing the sperm, maybe better quality sperm are put closer to the oocytes at the correct time of ovulation, and which is why IUI works in these categories of patients. So you can see here very clearly, as this slide shows, that if you do 3 cycles of ovarian stimulation, whether you use clomiphene citrate or you use letrozole with IUI, and you compare them to 3 cycles of expectant management, the IUI group has a much higher pregnancy rate of almost 31% live birth rate as compared to just 9% with expectant management. For male factor, maybe ovarian stimulation is not required. All you need to do is a good washing of the sperm. But again, it's very difficult to time an IUI in a natural cycle. So all of us prefer to give some form of stimulation for them, either a small dose of clomiphene or letrozole with HCG injection, just to be able to time the IUI much better. Of course, be very clear here that you should not be doing IUI for every patient of male factor. Do a trial sperm wash. If you are able to retrieve, say, 5 to 10 million good sperms with 90 to 95% rapid linear progressive motility, then it would be worthwhile to do maybe a couple of cycles of IUI for this patient. Also, if the female partner is above the age of 35, then there is evidence that it is best to add some gonadotropin stimulation so as to enhance your pregnancy rates. Again, you can see here, if you actually see success rates compared to the indications for IUI, best results are usually obtained in patients of anovulatory infertility, that is the PCOS, where you can expect a 20 to 25% chance of pregnancy with stimulation and IUI. Unexplained infertility, just about 15%. Male factor, again, just about 10 to 15%. Of course, elderly women above the age of, say, 38, 39, or patients with a very low AMH and antral follicle count, don't waste too much time with IUI. IVF is really successful. A lot of the papers that say that you should do IUI for these patients are more than 10 years old. We need to know that at that time, IVF results were not so great, but today IVF results are really good. So please be wary of the elderly patient with a poor ovarian reserve as to whether you should really waste too much time doing IUIs for this patient. So let's now get on to the main part. Now that you have a basic background of intrauterine insemination, what is the aim? Some other audios are interfering with my audio. The main aim,
I've muted also.
The main aim of ovarian stimulation in IUI, you don't want too many eggs. In IVF, you want too many eggs. In IUI, you want safety. You just want 2, 3, maybe 4 good quality follicles and oocytes. You don't want a premature LH surge, because that occurs in 25% of patients. That means 1 in 4 pregnancies, 1 in 4 patients will have a premature LH surge, and you lose the chance of making her pregnant. You definitely don't want hyperstimulation. You want a good endometrium. You want a good optimal pregnancy rate. And in the Indian context, you often want cost effectiveness also in these patients. So of course, you need to do ovarian reserve testing. And of course, we know all the indications, but for every patient who is undergoing IUI, IVF, ICSI, or whatever ART procedure, it's mandatory to first estimate ovarian reserve. This not only helps you to decide that how much time does this patient have on hand, how many months can you afford to do an IUI for her, does she need more aggressive treatment in the form of IVF or ICSI rather than wasting time with IUI, and so on. And of all the tests available to us, of course, the best is the antral follicle count and the AMH, without any doubt, because they do not have any intracycle or intercycle variability. AMH is a walk-in test, can be done on any day of the cycle. You don't have to wait for day 2 or day 3 like a basal FSH. And of course, it has a lot of advantages because it is usually consistent every time you check the same AMH level in the same patient. But please remember that we thought AMH is not affected by any other factor. But these are some indicators here. You can see potential factors which might influence AMH levels, and that is prolonged use of the OC pill or agonist will reduce AMH levels. PCOS patients will have very high AMH levels. Pregnancy, history of ovarian surgery, endometriosis will all be associated with lower AMH levels than are expected. So the first and our favorite, the good old clomiphene citrate. All of you know that it has to be administered in a dose of say 50 to 100 milligrams a day. You can start on day 2, 3, 4 or latest day 5 of cycle. Usually it's given for 5 days. You then monitor the follicles. Of course, you have to do a baseline scan on day 2. You have to make sure that the endometrium is completely shed, that there is no residual ovarian cyst from the previous cycle. You should not be mistaking for a follicle in this cycle. And then start monitoring from day 7 to see the dominant follicle, how it's growing, whether you need to add some HMG to increase or accelerate the growth of the follicle, whether you need to do something for the endometrium, and so on. And once the follicle reaches 18 to 19 mm in mean diameter, your endometrium is say more than 7 or 8 millimeters in thickness, a good trilamina pattern is seen. You can then administer the HCG injection and time your IUI at 36 to 40 hours post HCG. A lot of times with clomiphene, you see a very thin endometrium, and this is the famous anti-estrogenic effect of clomiphene directly at the level of the endometrium. No amount of exogenous estrogen administration here is going to help you improve that endometrium. So a very new way and a different way of giving clomiphene citrate has been suggested, and that is luteal phase clomiphene citrate. So what you do is, in a case of PCOS, if you have given her medroxyprogesterone to induce a withdrawal bleed, you don't, normally we would wait for the bleed and then begin clomiphene from day 2. This protocol says that as soon as you finish the medroxyprogesterone acetate, the next day you begin clomiphene citrate. That means before the menstruation begins. Of course, she will get her menstruation, but because you have given clomiphene before the period started, you get a better endometrial thickness, you get better estradiol levels, and you also have better pregnancy rates. So this is a different way of using clomiphene citrate in modern time. How many cycles don't keep doing clomiphene IUIs? 6 cycles, 10 cycles, 12 cycles, those days are gone. This is such an old paper from 2008, and yet we forget that the maximum pregnancies which are to occur with clomiphene and IUI, almost 50% will be in the first cycle itself, then about 15 or 20% in the second cycle, and after the third cycle, it is lower than 5%. So if any modality you start, whether it is clomiphene or aromatase inhibitors or gonadotropins, please restrict to just 2 cycles with one same modality. What about cycle cancellation? We often feel and we get panic calls, oh, the follicle is very good, everything is good, the sperm factor is good, her tubes are good, but with clomiphene, her endometrium is not crossing 7 millimeters, should I cancel the cycle? Yes, I agree. If this endometrium is less than 8 or 9 mm, your pregnancy rates will not be ideal. As you can see in this graph here, you can see best pregnancy rates are in the range of 10 mm thickness of the endometrium, but even below 7, it is not 0%. So please remember that even if you have a thin endometrium or an hyperplastic endometrium, as this next study shows, there is no indication to cancel the cycle. So you can see very clearly here that there is no evidence for any association between endometrial thickness and pregnancy rates when you are doing ovarian stimulation and IU. So don't just panic and cancel the cycle. You can still go ahead. You can counsel the patient that, okay, we may not expect 20%, but you will still have a 10% chance of pregnancy and the cycle would not be wasted. For PCOS, we had a big breakthrough in 2013 with Legro's first publication that letrozole works much better than clomiphene citrate for anovulatory infertility, and maybe it can be regarded as a replacement for clomiphene as first-line treatment of PCOS patients. Also, when you use a combination, especially in CC-resistant patients or safe patients with PCOS, you can see the letrozole metformin combination has a much better pregnancy rate, both in the first IUI as well as the
अमाउंट
cumulative
मला चेक करू दे
rates in
त्या
three
दिवशी करके
IUI,
गोंधळ नाही ना
letrozole metformin as compared to clomiphene metformin. Srini, again, there are some audios interfering.
Yeah, those who are joining in later, it takes 2 seconds to do that.
Okay.
कैलकुलेटर थे
Then again, if you see sequential treatment, whether it is clomiphene followed by HMG or letrozole followed by HMG, again, you can see the letrozole group does much better than the clomiphene group in PCOS patients. Mind you, till now, I have been talking about IUI and ovarian stimulation in anovulatory or PCOS patients. We have still not reached unexplained infertility, where there are a lot of changes which now need to be incorporated. So you can see here that in women with PCOS, undergoing, of course, this was a recent study from 2018, where again they confirmed that what is most important for us to be conscious of now, don't consider it a big achievement when you have a twin or a triplet pregnancy. It should be considered a failure of treatment. Our focus should not now be on having 3, 4, 5 follicles and twin, triplet, quadruplet pregnancies, but rather on establishing monofollicular development. And here you can clearly see that since letrozole has the highest monofollicular growth compared to clomiphene and gonadotropins, it should be first choice for PCOS and anovulation whenever you are doing IUI. What about gonadotropins? Now, the classic protocol, of course, was the step down protocol. You start with, say, 112.5 or 150, assess the patient after 7 days. Then, depending on the follicular sizes, you step down. If you see too many follicles growing too fast, you reduce the doses and hope that maybe you will just have your 2 or 3 dominant follicles at the end of this. But what works better for PCOS and what I find should be standard treatment now, especially with the availability of pen devices, multi-dose vials, you don't have the excuse that you will be wasting gonadotropins with the 75 IU ampules. And please try to do a chronic low dose step up for PCOS patients. So you start with a simple dose of say 50, maximum 75 IU. If she's very lean, thin PCOS, you can even start with 37.5 and give this small dose for 10 to 14 days. At 14 days, you assess the response. Almost 50-60% of them would not have responded, but the follicles are getting more and more sensitive. You then step up the dose just by 37.5 or 50. Again, maintain that dose for 7 days. Again, reassess. Once you see a dominant follicle, then you can maintain that same dose to keep the follicle growing. And when it reaches 18 millimeters, you give HCG and do your IUI again at 36 to 40 hours. What I find works best and what is my favorite protocol, especially for a medium or heavy BMI PCOS in India, is a starting dose of 112.5. So it's a dose where you don't have cancellations for no response, and at the same time, you don't have too much of hyperstimulation. And as this paper showed in 2016, you can see the rate of monofollicular cycles with 112.5 is as high as 40%. Pregnancy rates are excellent at 30%. OHSS, just mild OHSS, 3 out of 29 patients, as low as 10%. Multiple pregnancy rate was almost 0%. So this dose seems to be an ideal dose for most of our Indian PCOS patients. Somehow it's like a magic number, not here, not there. 112.5, very easy to titrate, both with the multi-dose vials as well as with the pen devices which you have available. And of course, recombinant cost is also almost down now, not on par with urinary, but marginally higher. And it's definitely worth the expense to use this molecule and use the devices so that there is no wastage of drug when you want to titrate small doses of 37.5 or 50 IU. If you are a beginner and you want to learn how should I decide what dose to give a particular patient, this nomogram works beautifully. You just have to plot the antral follicle count versus the weight of the patient. For example, if you see here, I have a patient who weighs 65 kg with an antral follicle count of 15. My starting dose should be 75 IU for this patient. So this works beautifully, especially for PCOS where you're scared of hyperstimulation. You don't want to go too high with your doses. All you need to do is use this nomogram to decide on the dose. What about daily versus alternate? Again, don't do cost cutting because it's just not worth the drop in success rates. You can see here With daily FSH, your success rate is as high as 40%. With alternate day FSH, it is half at just about 20%. So there is no question of trying to cut costs and using alternate day FSH or HMG. It doesn't work. The wildly fluctuating levels of FSH and HMG will cause a lot of follicular atresia. You may think, oh, the follicle grew, it ruptured, but the oocyte becomes atretic because of the sudden drops in endogenous FSH levels when you do this kind of a practice. So don't do alternate day FSH. You have to give them daily doses. Again, now, as I told you earlier, 1 in 4 patients, whatever you do, especially in a gonadotropin stimulated IUI cycle, will have a premature LH surge. Now, this is a huge number. That means 1 in 4 patients, you are losing your chance for a pregnancy because of this premature LH surge. And that is why we now advise that maybe if you have had an experience of a luteinized unruptured follicle in a previous cycle, it would be best to combine the gonadotropin with an antagonist in this patient. So very easy. Your starting dose is the same, 75, 112.5, 150 as per AMH, BMI, previous response, ovarian appearance, antral follicle count, the usual factors which you take into consideration when deciding the dose. From day 6 or day 7, you start monitoring the follicle. When you have a lead follicle of about, say, 14 millimeters in diameter, you begin giving 0.25 milligrams of cetrorelix or ganirelix. That continues daily with the FSH or HMG until your lead follicle is at 18 millimeters in mean diameter. That morning, you give the last antagonist. You withhold gonadotropin on that day. So on the day when you reach 18 mm, you don't give FSH or HMG. You just give the antagonist in the morning. You give your HCG trigger at, say, 3 o'clock or 4 o'clock in the afternoon. If it's, say, a Monday, Wednesday morning at 40 hours post HCG, you can plan the intrauterine insemination. So very easy to do. And if you look here, very clearly, there is almost more than a doubling of the pregnancy rates the minute you add an antagonist with the IUI, especially in PCOS patients or patients who have had a previous history of LUF, unruptured follicles or cyst formations in the past. It's best to add an antagonist in subsequent cycles. And in the lower half, if you can see with our own clinic also, when we were using only urinary FSH, success rates were in the range of 15%. When we added cetrorelix, it almost doubled to more than 30% per cycle. Of course, most of the international studies also agree with this. There are some groups who are not in favor of routinely using the antagonists. It's finally your personal choice, but it makes life much easier. And also with the antagonist, you can coast for a day. Now, suppose your follicles are ready on a Friday. If you have not given the antagonist and you push the HCG to Saturday because you don't want to do IUI on a Sunday, you're most going to end up with a disaster in that cycle. If you have used the antagonist, you can give a half dose of the gonadotropin with antagonist on Saturday, then administer HCG on Friday, administer HCG on Saturday evening, and do your IUI on Monday morning. So that is how the antagonist helps in your daily practice, makes things easier, more efficient, and saves that 1 in 4 patient from failing because of a premature LH surge. A lot of times I am asked that how to time the IUI. Should I do a single IUI or a double IUI? Simple physiology. If you remember this one slide, you will never have a problem deciding how to do your IUI. So in clomiphene and letrozole cycles, we normally give HCG anytime between 17 to 23 millimeters. In gonadotropin cycles, we like to give it at 18 millimeters or so. Remember that ovulation usually occurs at 38 to 40 hours post HCG. And now the two most important points, that once you wash a semen sample, your semen sample is washed and is lying there, this washed sperm can fertilize eggs only for 2 to 3 hours post preparation. So if you have given HCG on Monday and you do an IUI on Monday or Tuesday morning and the eggs rupture on Wednesday morning, that IUI is totally useless because once sperm is washed, the sperm is capacitated and it is only capable of fertilization for 3 hours. Oocytes, on the other hand, once they are released, can be fertilized for 12 to 16 hours post-release. So please remember this. If you get these two facts correct in your mind, you will never fall wrong with the timing. So it's always best to do an IUI around the time or post-ovulation to ensure that you get the best outcome of this treatment. So you can see here that the best results usually are at 42 to 46 hours post-HCG. Does it make a difference at what follicular size you give the HCG? It doesn't. Whether you give it at 18, you give it at 19, 20, 21, 22. In a clomiphene cycle, the success rate is the same. So you don't have to worry. You can easily push or pull one day to avoid a Sunday and get your equivalent pregnancy rates. Again, as this study showed, the best success rate is, you can see here, 38% when IUI is done at 42 hours post HCG, as against 20% at 36 hours and 24% at 48 hours. What about luteal phase support? Now we know that patients who have done clomiphene IUI cycles do not need to be given any luteal phase support. So you don't need to pump in micronized vaginal progesterones for this patient. But for all other categories, whenever you have used gonadotropins, especially FSH or HMG cycles, it is mandatory to supplement the luteal phase. You don't have to give a very high dose because she has a good functioning corpus luteum. This is not an IVF cycle that you've aspirated everything. There is a good corpus luteum. 200 or 300 milligrams, just 200 milligrams BID is what we normally recommend for this kind of gonadotropin IUI cycles. Is any one preparation superior to the other? Not really. If you look here, vaginal capsules, vaginal gel, sustained release, all of them give you the same results. You don't really have to worry. It's your personal choice. And of course, now we have the Lotus trial, which says that in any cycle, whether it is IUI, whether it is IVF with a fresh embryo transfer, any cycle where you have a functioning corpus luteum. So obviously you cannot include frozen embryo transfers, oocyte donations, embryo donations where you don't have and you have suppressed ovulation in that month. Any other cycle where there is a functioning corpus luteum, dydrogesterone 10 milligrams TID is sufficient as luteal phase support. So you don't need to give any MVP to these patients. You can just give her oral, which is the easiest and the most convenient compliant group of administration, and just give her dydrogesterone 10 TID, and that's usually more than enough for a complete luteal phase support without the need for any MVP. Of course, never forget this. This is only valid for patients where you have a functioning corpus luteum. Always be realistic. The biggest problem in infertility is patient dropout, and patient dropout is because of giving unreal statistics. When you are counseling a patient for IUI, tell her if it's a male factor that it's just a 1 in 10 chance that you will have a pregnancy. For most of the other factors, you have to explain to them that it's just 15%, maximum 20% or 25%, even with the best of gonadotropins and antagonist cycles. So it's very important that the patient should be mentally prepared for what she's getting into, and should also be prepared that if this fails, there is a lot of treatment available even after this in the form of IVF, ICSI and ART and all that. As practicing gynecologist, the last thing you want in your hands in your clinic is an ovarian hyperstimulation. So it's high time now that we all aim to have OHSS free clinics. Whether you're doing IUI, IVF, you don't want patients coming to you with ascites, pleural effusion, tappings, protein drips, and so on for something which was considered such a simple treatment just to get pregnant. So you have to be very conscious of this. All gonadotropin patients, counsel them before you start that if you hyperstimulate, especially those with an AMH of more than 3 or 3.5, classical PCOS on ultrasound, counsel them that there is a possibility 10% that I might have to cancel the cycle if you hyperstimulate, and or there is an option that if you are mentally prepared, I can send you to the neighborhood IVF clinic. We can convert the IUI to an IVF and give you a 5 times higher pregnancy rate at almost 50 to 60%. So this has to be told before you start. If you start telling the patient on day 7 or day 8 that after spending so much on gonadotropins, I now need to convert you to IVF and you have to spend so many lakhs more, it's really going to be disastrous for you and the patient is not going to take it very well. So it's very important to stimulate, counsel them before you begin the stimulation cycle. The second most important slide I want to show you is multiple pregnancies. All of us have this mental perception that all twins and triplets come from IVF centers. If you look at this data from the US, 22% of all twins, 40% of triplets, and 70% of quadruplets or higher order pregnancies are from non-IVF cycles. So these are all from OI and IUI cycles. Please be aware of this, and we now need to really focus on reducing our multiple pregnancy rates because the perinatal morbidity mortality is really high. We had a study conducted at our own clinic by the Institute of Research in Reproduction, a government institute. They followed up 200 of my consecutive pregnancies with IVF, and we got a shocking feedback that we had a 40% incidence. This was of course 5 years ago when we were still transferring 3 embryos, 40% incidence of multiple pregnancy. And in the twin pregnancies, there was a 66% incidence of preterm labor requiring NICU admission. Now, this is just not acceptable in today's time. So please, now we need to be very conscious of being able to reduce our multiple pregnancy rates. Of course, we are now down to just double embryo transfer for every possible patient. And we were of course planning before this whole virus thing hit us that maybe by this middle of this year, we would have switched to just single blastocyst transfer. But I'm sure that once we reopen, our entire focus will be on eliminating twins and higher order multiple pregnancies totally. Since we now have the antagonist to control ovulation, why do we need stimulation in unexplained infertility? So in normal ovulatory patients where you're doing an IUI for male factor or endometriosis or any other indication besides PCO, why not just do a natural cycle monitoring? Start the antagonist when the lead follicle, natural follicle is 14-15 millimeters in mean diameter. Just use HCG to time your 36 to 40 hour IUI procedure, and you don't need to give her any other stimulatory agent, because the whole idea of giving stimulation was to be able to give HCG and time the procedure well. Now with the antagonist, maybe we could just do this, and this is food for thought and food for research that we need to seriously consider doing a lot of natural cycle IUIs. What is very important today now for all of you as a take-home message is to understand these ASRM guidelines very, very clearly. For unexplained infertility, which is again a 40 to 50% chunk of your IUI practice, what should you and shouldn't you be doing? IUI in natural cycles, very clear based on huge number of RCTs which they have studied over the last 10 to 15 years. These guidelines have been formulated. Of course, I didn't want to make the lecture too lengthy by showing you each meta-analysis and all the studies done for each factor. So I've summarized the recommendations here that IUI in natural cycles is just not recommended in the treatment of unexplained infertility. What about clomiphene with timed intercourse? Again, clomiphene with timed intercourse is not superior and not better than expectant management. So again, it has no role to play. If you are just giving them clomiphene, there are some patients I have seen, they are given clomiphene, you take it on your own month after month for 3-4 months. This is not recommended because it doesn't help to improve the pregnancy rates. What about letrozole with timed intercourse? Again, it is not recommended because it is neither superior to expectant management and in no way differs from expectant management. So letrozole with intercourse not to be recommended. Gonadotropins with timed intercourse, again not recommended. Very high incidence of multiple pregnancy, and the time to pregnancy and pregnancy rate is not higher than expectant management. So one thing is very clear, that in unexplained infertility, you will not use any of these oral medications or gonadotropins and just tell the patient to have planned intercourse. It's not going to work. What about IUI with clomiphene citrate? Now, this is the first one where there is very strong evidence from all the available RCTs. It is strongly recommended to use clomiphene citrate with IUI for 3 cycles in the treatment of couples with unexplained infertility. Same with IUI with letrozole. There is no difference between clomiphene and letrozole as far as pregnancy rates are concerned, but it is definitely much better than expectant management or natural cycle IUI. So clomiphene or letrozole, whatever is your choice, with IUI should be first line management for unexplained infertility. 3 cycles are usually sufficient before you move on to more advanced ART treatment. Now, these 2 are the most important summary statements, because I used to use a lot of gonadotropins with clomiphene in unexplained infertility for all these years. But the current evidence suggests that this is not recommended, because you are not improving your you are increasing the multiple pregnancy rate to unacceptable levels. So IUI with clomiphene and FSH or HMG in unexplained infertility in low doses is not recommended. What about just gonadotropin with IUI? Again, it is not recommended, again, just for the multiple pregnancy rate, which is much higher. Conventional doses of more than 150 IU, again, it is not recommended to do IUIs for unexplained infertility using FSH or HMG, again, for the higher multiple pregnancy rate. So we are very clear now that PCOS, yes, you use gonadotropins, you use antagonists, you use letrozole, use clomiphene, do your IUIs. But for unexplained infertility, 3 cycles of either clomiphene IUI or letrozole IUI, and you move on to IVF. Or is it really time for IVF at this time? So it is very important now to know that most of the studies which are available, and which is why they said 3 months of clomiphene, then 3 months of gonadotropin, and then IVF, At that time, IVF success rates were much lower than what we see today. So we have to remember now that for any woman who is above the age of 38, it would be better to directly proceed with IVF for patients of unexplained infertility. For younger patients with a good ovarian reserve, 3 cycles of clomiphene letrozole with IUI, again followed directly by IVF. So now it is very important to realize that IVF results with current success rates almost averaging at 50% per cycle in most centers. Remember that it is a much shorter time to pregnancy and lower cost per pregnancy when you compare it to doing gonadotropins and IUI for say 3 cycles, 4 cycles before doing IVF. So it's very clear now that we should not be wasting time on gonadotropins and IUIs in unexplained infertility. So that's an important take-home message for the day. What about IVF ovarian stimulation? Now here the entire thing shifts to a totally different area, that instead of 2 eggs, we probably want 20 eggs if we want to give her the best outcome. Now, what do we mean by good ovarian stimulation in IVF? Of course, we want patient acceptability, we want efficacy in terms of success rates, we want safety, and we don't want hyperstimulation, and we want to keep the cost reasonably low. We want to totally eliminate hyperstimulation. We want to be a OHSS-free clinic. So what do we consider as a goal or of ovarian stimulation? Is your goal just to have 1 cycle with 1 euploid embryo? Is your goal to do 1 cycle and get at least 1 live birth? Or what should be your goal is 1 cycle and be done with it. Means get as many eggs as possible in the first cycle, freeze as many embryos in the first cycle. So not only does she have her first live birth, but the same embryos will also give her second live birth after a couple of years. So that is how the paradigm shift has occurred in IVF stimulation now, that our doses have to be a little higher than we were usually giving to ensure that we get maximum eggs, maximum embryos in the first cycle itself. Now, what do I mean by more eggs? Do I mean 40, 50, 100 eggs? So let's review that a bit, that what is the ideal number of eggs that you should be targeting when you do ovarian stimulation in IVF? The first most important aim in IVF is you want a uniform cohort of follicles. Now, I'm sure you read this line again and again everywhere, but please understand each word. You don't want 1 follicle to go ahead of the others. All those of you who have been using the antagonist protocol with or without any pretreatment will surely agree with me that in 30% of these patients, 1 follicle becomes dominant and the others are lagging behind. And then there is the dilemma that should I give HCG when that lead follicle, which is probably the best, reaches 18, or should I wait for the others to grow and then sacrifice the bigger one and let it become post-mature? So this is very important, that your pre-treatment before you start stimulation is most important to ensure that you get a uniform cohort. Second, of course, you don't want the eggs to rupture. So it's standard international practice to use an agonist or an antagonist to prevent the premature LH surge. Old thinking was that you need 5 to 15 good quality oocytes because the fresh embryo transfer pregnancy rates, mind you, again, I repeat, fresh embryo transfer pregnancy rates are best between 5 and 15 good quality oocytes. Beyond 15, fresh embryo pregnancy rates were not good. And this is, of course, before the times of excellent vitrification and frozen embryo transfers. 5 to 15 was considered as the best. And of course, you don't want hyperstimulation. You want good number of embryos for freezing. You want the perfect endometrium and so on. And you don't want hyperstimulation. Never forget Sankara's original study. Very important to see. You can see why did I say 5 to 15. You can see here from 5 to 15 oocytes, the pregnancy rates keep on increasing with fresh embryo transfer. Then there is a bit of a plateau, and then pregnancy rates actually start falling because with too many eggs, you have a very supraphysiologic high estradiol and progesterone levels. This puts the endometrial receptivity totally out of phase and you don't get good pregnancy rates. Also, you have a group who gives you 4 or less oocytes, which is the poor responder, which again, you will agree that in today's practice, especially in Mumbai, Pune, Delhi, Bangalore, in metropolitan cities where the average age of the couples coming to us is between 30 and 40, you have almost an epidemic of poor responders hitting us. Almost 40% of patients have low AMH, low AFC, or are above the age of 35. So we need to focus on these 3 categories of patients: the poor responder, the normal responder, and the high responder or the PCOS patient. Also remember that with advancing age, you need more and more number of oocytes to give you that one euploid normal embryo. For example, before 37, under the age of 37 or 38, you need 9 oocytes to make you one euploid embryo. But you can see how with advancing age, there is a much higher incidence of aneuploidic embryos, and you need more and more oocytes to get that one normal euploid embryo. So this is very important to remember. And also, we know today that fresh live birth rates, as I told you earlier, are best until 15 oocytes. This paper showed that it was best until 13 oocytes, and above 13, the pregnancy rates start falling with fresh embryo transfer. But that's not the message for today. Cumulative live birth rates, you can see, go on increasing with higher number of oocytes. So the more oocytes you have, the more embryos you have, the more embryo freezing you do, the more number of embryo transfer procedures you can get from the same cycle. And therefore you don't see the fall or the plateau, but a moderate increase, and this goes on increasing until 27 oocytes. So the ideal number of oocytes in current IVF practice seems to be somewhere around 25. So 20 to 25 oocytes is where you will probably do in 60-70% of patients just one cycle and be done. By be done, we mean not only does she have a first baby, but she also has a second live birth with the same frozen embryos after a couple of years. So this is what we mean by that this segmentation of IVF. What we mean by segmentation is that we are not doing fresh embryo transfers for anyone with more than say 13 or 14 oocytes. And this has absolutely revolutionized the entire treatment, because we don't now measure success by IVF embryo pregnancy rates per fresh embryo transfer. Rather, we look at cumulative live birth rate, that how many transfers can you give her from the same cycle, and that will always depend on the number of oocytes that you retrieve. Again, oocyte yield beyond 25 to 27 is not very important, because then the ovaries will be too enlarged. Although you will not get OHSS, you will not have ascites or pleural effusion, but you will have the occasional ovarian torsion, and you need to be wary of that and not go ballistic with your doses. Coming to actual protocols, don't get confused with this slide. We are not going to discuss so many protocols. This is just to show you that if you go through literature, there are so many different ways in which the agonists and antagonists have been used. But the classical 3 protocols, of course, the ultra short protocol, where you give the agonist just on days 2, 3, and 4. Short protocol, you start from day 2 and go on till the day of HCG. Long protocol, you start from the mid luteal phase of the previous cycle and continue the agonist until the day of HCG. Just the first 2 are not very popular, which we still really encourage, at least at our clinic. 50% of cycles I do are still long agonist cycles, unlike the rest of the world where everybody just switched over to the antagonist. But I will show you data as to why I feel that the agonist is still superior in a lot of ways. So very easy for those of you who have never done it. You have to start Leuprolide or Buserelin from day 21 of the luteal phase of the previous cycle. Normally we start with 0.5 ml daily until she gets her menstruation. On day 2, day 3, day 4, you can assess her for down regulation. And once you're satisfied that she's down regulated, you then begin the FSH or HMG on any day of your convenience, which is the whole beauty of the long protocol, that you can play with the cycle, you can schedule it, you can avoid your weekends and so on. At that time, we reduce from 0.5 to 0.3 ml, which continues until the day of HCG. Sounds very easy to do, but because you have completely cut off endogenous FSH LH, you have to give a little higher dose of FSH and HMG than you would give with the short antagonist cycle. There are some important points for optimization, and these are the secrets or the tricks of doing the long protocol. One is, how do you know that she is well down regulated? For some of you who do batch IVF and say you do 20 patients are on down regulation, how do you know that all of them are well down regulated? Simple rule of 5, when she comes on day 3, day 4, there should be no follicle or no cyst more than 5 millimeters. The endometrium should be completely shed and less than 5 millimeters in thickness. The FSH level should be less than 5, LH less than 5, estradiol less than 50, progesterone less than 0.5. So it's a very easy rule of 5s. Once you are an expert with just ultrasound, you don't need to really check FSH, LH, T2 and T4. You can just see the endometrium, see the thick lining, look at the ovaries, and you are very sure that she is completely down regulated. Now in a batch, you have to watch for escape. 1 in 15 or 1 in 20 patients, the dose may not be adequate. She will start having the dominant follicle growing. The endometrium will become a triple line. Don't then start FSH HMG for this patient. You have to omit that patient from the batch. She has escaped the effect of the agonist. You cannot continue with her, otherwise her follicle is already going to be ready even before you start the exogenous FSH and HMG. Of course, you don't want to suppress for too long a time, so you may have to use OC pills before, so that you don't have to use the agonist for a very long time and induce menopausal symptoms and backaches and all that. Also, you should remember that because you have suppressed LH so much, some categories of patients like elderly patients, potential poor responders will need LH right from the beginning. And as a thumb rule, for me, every patient where I downregulate or use an agonist, I prefer to use HP-HMG for stimulation rather than just FSH alone. I strongly feel that you need LH right from the beginning if you are to get a very good response in these patients. The biggest drawback is if you feel she is hyperstimulating, you can't do anything in between during the cycle. You can only give an HCG trigger. You don't have the flexibility of using an agonist trigger in these patients. So obviously anybody with an AMH of more than 2.5 or 3, where you expect her to be a potential high responder with more than 15 follicles, don't use the long agonist protocol. So these are all the fine tuning points. The biggest drawback, of course, all of you know, is the higher risk of OHSS. If you select the wrong patient, a high responder, and downregulate her, you are going to end up with an explosion of the ovaries and an admission for ascites, pleural effusion, and all kinds of complications. A bit of increased cost because you have to use a little higher dose of FSH and HMG. More injections and all that is fine. Usually Indian patients don't complain too much about the number of injections, but you have to be very careful with OHSS in this category. And which is why the antagonist protocol became so popular worldwide, which I already described to you in the IUI cycles. Same way, of course, the starting doses will be higher than IUI. Day 2, you do your scan, make sure she's shed off endometrium completely, no cysts, no follicles. Start your FSH or HMG. Day 6, day 7, when the lead follicle is 14 millimeters, you begin the antagonist. Continue both. Once the follicles are 18 millimeters, you give your HCG. On that day, withhold gonadotropin, give the morning dose of antagonist, and do your egg retrieval at 36 hours. Remember that when you give a single shot of 0.25 milligrams of antagonist, LH is reduced by 75%, FSH reduced by 23%, 6 hours after you administer the dose. But these levels return to baseline within 24 hours, which is why you have to give it daily until the day of HCG. And also, because there is no complete suppression, you still have enough endogenous FSH-LH, which will give you a good surge with the agonist trigger in case she hyperstimulates and you can't give her the HCG trigger. So that is the beauty of the antagonist protocol. Again, fine-tuning points. Pre-treatment is the most important and most neglected area of an antagonist cycle. Most people either give the OC pill, which is not advised anymore. Please discontinue using OC pills totally from your practice. It just doesn't help any patient, and there's a lot of data that you get lower pregnancy rates. There is too much consumption of gonadotropins. There is prolonged follicular phase of stimulation and so on. There is just one new paper by Polizos this year in Human Reproduction, but there he clearly says just 10 days of the OC pill. So if you are going to use just 10 days for programming, it's fine. The suppression is not too much, but anything beyond the usual 10, 20, 30, 40 days, which people tend to give to bring their batches together, is not recommended. You have 3 other very good options for cycle scheduling. One is the use of estradiol valerate in the luteal phase. Second is norethisterone. And third is the use of the antagonist, which I will describe in some time. Second point, antagonist should not start from a fixed day. Don't say, okay, day 6 means start giving antagonist. It has to be flexible as per the follicular size. So when you have 14 millimeter follicle, that is the day the antagonist should be started. The next important point, a lot of people make the mistake that when you start antagonist, that means you need to step up the FSH or the HMG. This is not to be done. You have to maintain your same dose, because any increase or decrease of dose is not going to work the way you feel it is going to work from that day. So just continue whatever you have been giving to her. There is no need to panic. Maybe a couple of, she will take 2 or 3 days more if she has some polymorphisms of her FSH or LH receptors, but you don't need to increase the FSH dose on that day. The time interval between 2 antagonists should not exceed 30 hours. So try to maintain the same time every day. The time between the last antagonist and HCG also should not exceed 30 hours. The biggest problem with antagonists is you cannot delay by 2-3 days like you can with the agonist cycle. So you cannot do coasting. If you are doing a batch on the antagonist, if you have 10 patients, 2 of them may be slow, 1 of them may be too fast. You cannot adjust the dates of their pickups. Otherwise, those eggs will be either immature or post-mature. And that is the biggest drawback of the antagonist, which is why in India, it may not be the protocol of choice if you are doing batch IVF. If you have a daily ongoing cycle program, 365-day program, you don't have to worry. You can use the antagonist for all your patients. But otherwise, this is one of the biggest drawbacks of the antagonist. The biggest beauty of the antagonist cycle, of course, is the flexibility that you are able to use an agonist trigger. And this is what made all good IVF clinics OHSS free. The minute we have a patient of PCO, high AMH, you have given a 150, 225, you see 20, 30 follicles, no panic, just don't give her HCG, give her the agonist trigger, pick up all the oocytes, even if they're 30, 40. I've taken out 86 oocytes from one patient and she didn't even call me once. The next day, the ovaries just settle down. It's so beautiful. There's no hyperstimulation whatsoever. But because the short life of the agonist is very small compared to HCG, which has a longer half-life of 7 days, you cannot do a fresh embryo transfer in these patients because the corpora lutea are highly deficient and you don't have enough luteal phase support for the embryo. So you cannot do a transfer. You have to pick up everything, freeze all the embryos, and then transfer in the next month. So with the advent of vitrification and the excellent results that we have now, we just don't bother about it anymore because the success rates with the freeze-all are just too good. And you can see here that in a normal responder, now let's begin with the normal responder. You learned of how to use the agonist, how to use the antagonist, and the beauty of using the agonist trigger. What should be the dose in a normal responder? Now, please get these slides very, very accurately because I often see people giving 450, 600. All these are illogical doses. Very important to remember that in a normal responder, don't go too low because you may not get enough oocytes. Don't go too high if you are still doing fresh transfers and don't want hyperstimulation. So you can see here clearly, this was 2018. You can see here, if you look at oocytes, number of oocytes retrieved, they are much higher with 200 as compared to 100 IU. They are also much higher than 150 IU. So the perfect dose for a young patient under 35, no complicating PCOS, endometriosis, first cycle, maybe male factor, maybe unexplained, you need to give her 225 IU of FSH or HMG. So that is the best. If you go to 300, there is no improvement in the number of oocytes retrieved. Very important point here. So please titrate your doses and be very clear. Normal responder, 225 should be your cutoff because less than that, you will not get enough oocytes. More than 225, you are not going to get more oocytes. What about cycle cancellation rates? Again, you don't want to underdose, you don't want to overdose. You can see here, cycle cancellation is much lower with 200 as compared to 100 because with 100, many times she may not respond at all and you have to cancel the cycle. Also, 225 is better than 150, but again, 225 is 300 versus 300. Sorry, somebody asked something? No, okay. So this is very important to remember that again, for cycle cancellation rates also, 225 IU is the best. If you give 300, again, there is a very high chance of a high response in some of these normal responders, which you don't want. So you must maintain a dose of 225. A lot of people, they start with the low dose, getting worried about hyperstimulation. So you start with 150 and then on day 7, you find, oh, she's just got 3 follicles. What do I do? Let's step up to 450. Now, does this work? This is the commonest mistake that a lot of people make. Does this work? And you can clearly see here that on day 7, that is the scan decision point when I decide that, okay, maybe my dose was not enough. And let's see, I want to increase the dose to try and get more follicles. But what you need to remember is that you will not, any dose you increase, for that dose to be effective, it takes 3 to 4 days. So if you start stepping up on day 7, that dose will not be active till day 10. And if any new recruitment occurs after day 10, that follicle will not be ready until day 18. So what is the point? So the whole point of this slide is that don't make dose adjustments on day 7. Increasing or decreasing the dose on day 7 doesn't work because of simple basic physiology that you just will not achieve anything until 3 days after you have increased the doses. After the normal responder, let's move on to the high responder, which is always the danger area. Everybody is scared of the thin, lean PCOS, what dose to use. Very simple, you just have to remember the 3 musketeers. Antagonist very strictly, agonist triggering, no HCG very strictly, and freeze all. You just have to remember this slide. Your management of the high responder is done and sorted. And how did it begin? The whole freeze all story actually began with high responders. And that was the PCOS, where we used to have real problem managing them. We used to have 2 admissions a week for ascites and pleural effusion and all the things you all are familiar with in PCOS. So this was our first study in 2015, which we did, 127 patients of PCOS. All were recruited for the short antagonist cycle with a fixed starting dose of REC-FSH 150 IU. All were given the same 0.2 milligram agonist trigger. For all, we picked up the oocytes, fertilized them, and froze the embryos on day 2 of that is at the 4-cell stage. And all of them had a thaw transfer at the 8-cell stage in the next month in an agonist downregulated and artificially estrogen progesterone prime cycle. So here you can see this is very simple standard protocol for all PCOS. And you can see in the first beta HCG, first frozen embryo transfer for these patients, success rate extremely high at 56 to 57%. And even if you discount the early pregnancy losses, the miscarriages and the ectopic pregnancies, the clinical pregnancy rate is still very high at almost 50% per cycle. Which other treatment is so successful for a severe PCOS patient? So PCOS is almost conquered now with this approach of just doing an antagonist. Whether you give 150, 225, doesn't really matter. If she's a very obese patient, 225 is fine. Just pick up all the oocytes. Don't worry about anything. Give the agonist trigger. Your first frozen transfer with good quality embryos, 5 out of 10 will be pregnant. Second embryo transfer, another 2 will be pregnant. Your cumulative pregnancy rate will be almost 80% at the end of 3 frozen embryo transfers. So this is very important that this is the only way now you have to manage high responders and PCOS patients. Of course, now suppose you don't have a very good vitrification program, what do you do? So there were studies that you can add back HCG. So you can see here where they used to trigger with agonist triggering with add back 1500 or 1000 IU of HCG on the day of egg retrieval. But you can see again, there is an unacceptably high incidence of pregnancy-induced hyperstimulation in these patients. So although you get decent pregnancy rates of 30 to 40% per cycle, you still have an unacceptable 10 to 11% risk of severe OHSS in these patients. So personally, I am not too much in favor of this, but if you feel that you need to do a fresh embryo transfer with a mild risk, a small risk of hyperstimulation, you could go ahead and give her the HCG add back. The biggest problem in these high responders is not just that you can't do a fresh embryo transfer because the endometrium receptivity is not good, but also because a lot of these patients, is almost 16%, the minute you cross 18 oocytes, 15 to 20% of these patients will have premature rise of progesterone. That is, the progesterone on the day of HCG will be higher than 1.5. And this, as we know, causes advancement of the endometrium histologically. So you may see a fantastic triple line endometrium, but it is just not receptive because of these supraphysiologic estradiol and progesterone levels. So you need to remember this. Just a 2-3 slides on premature progesterone rise. You can see it equally affects both agonist and antagonist cycles. The minute the progesterone levels are more than 1.5, there is a drop in the pregnancy rate, both with the agonist as well as the antagonist. Again, what a lot of people tend to do, day 7, you see 30, 40 follicles, you panic and you step down. From 150, you go down to 100 or go down to 75. And again, please remember that this is not going to work, because the minute you decide to reduce a dose or even stop the dose, it takes again the same 3 to 5 days for that to take effect. And by then your leading follicles are already ready. So please don't do this kind of practice. All you need to do is just give the agonist trigger, don't give HCG, and freeze all. So increasing the doses on day 7 doesn't work. Decreasing the doses on day 7 doesn't work. So what is the take home message? You're deciding of the starting dose is where all your skill lies. And that is where you have to be very, very sure that you're giving her the perfect dose to get the perfect number of oocytes so that she's done in one ovarian stimulation cycle. Is frozen embryo transfer better if the progesterone is elevated? Yes. We have a lot of studies now. You can see all the blue lines are the frozen embryo transfer pregnancy rates. Red lines are the fresh embryo transfer pregnancy rates in patients who have premature rise of progesterone. And our own results, you can see frozen embryo transfer all through almost always above 50, sometimes around 60% per cycle. So the frozen FET results are right now so good that we don't think twice All you need to do, the minute you see 12, 13, 15, 20 oocytes, you feel patient is thin, she is fussy, she is not going to be able to bear the pain, just freeze the embryos and don't do a fresh embryo transfer for high responders. The best predictor for OHSS, of course, there are E2 levels, number of follicles, so on. But the presence of more than 15 follicles of 11 millimeter in mean diameter is the best predicting factor that this patient might have an increase in the incidence of OHSS. Now, if by mistake you have started the patient on a long agonist protocol, sometimes you may find that she hyperstimulates and you don't know what to do because you can't use the agonist trigger for these patients. You have to give HCG. Then of course, there are all the classical recommendations. Lowering the dose, which I showed you, doesn't work. Coasting might help to reduce E2 levels, but doesn't really gives you a poor outcome because the oocytes are not too good as far as quality is concerned. Cycle cancellation, I feel, is the best option. Even if you have just explained to the patient, it's not worth the risk. If I coast, the eggs will not be good. You'll just be wasting more money. Better that we start again with the antagonist cycle. Cryopreservation and then giving Keberlin and all that might work if it is a borderline case. And of course,
seminar
you can continue the agonist post-oocyte retrieval. So just to summarize a bit, in case you want to remember very easily, there are two categories. One is where a patient, you predicted that she will have a high ovarian response, where you will always use the antagonist protocol. You will use your 150 or 225 IU. You will use agonist trigger almost for all. Sometimes you may do 1000 IU HCG add back. And of course, whether to do a fresh transfer or a freeze-all transfer will all depend on the number of follicles and the final clinical picture of that patient. Management of the poor responder, again, why I keep including these slides is because this is now becoming the chunk of my practice. Almost 50% of my patients fall in this category. Either they are young, they are old, they have low AMH, low AFC. Previous cycles have given just 2 eggs, 3 eggs. Do we really have anything to offer them? If you look at the literature, 32 different recommended interventions for poor responders. And that is why all the confusion, should you use a long protocol, short protocol, antagonist, agonist, modified flare, and so on and so forth. So let's put things right. Of course, I don't want to go too much into it because that's more of an IVF thing, but you need to be aware because a lot of your patients which you refer for IVF would be potential poor responders. So here you have 3 categories. The first patient is one who has a diminished ovarian reserve. Now this one has a less number of FSH sensitive follicles. So whatever dose you give her, whatever molecule you give her FSH, HMG, she is not going to give you a good ovarian response. The second is you gave an inadequate dose. So she had a good number of follicles, but the dose was not enough to stimulate all the recruited follicles, and therefore you did not get a perfect response. And the third is she had the number of follicles. You gave her the perfect dose, but yet you didn't get what you expected because she will be in that 20% who is a carrier of a FSH or a LH receptor polymorphism. So these are the patients. We now have the test available to us. You can easily check for polymorphisms, and it should now be mandatory, especially in IVF clinics, to do this test so that you are forewarned that this patient is going to be a hyporesponder. Follicles will just not grow beyond day 7, day 8. You'll need to pump in a lot of FSH. Better to start HP, HMG or LH right from the beginning for these patients, and so on. If you understand these 3 categories, management is extremely simple. So you have to remember, now we have the Poseidon criteria, which makes it very simple to manage these patients. Simply put, I don't want to go too much into it. Group 1 and group 2 are young and old patients. So 1 is under 35, 2 is above 35, who have a normal ovarian reserve. So they have normal AMH, normal AFC. You expect them to respond normally. You give them 225, you expect 15 eggs, but you get just less than 4 eggs, in which case they fall in subgroup 1A, or you get just 4 to 9 eggs, in which case they fall in subgroup 1B. So these are the unexpected 50% of patients in an IVF clinic where everything looked good, but you either didn't get the number of follicles you expected, you didn't get the number of eggs you expected, you didn't get the number of metaphase 2 you expected, you didn't get the number of top quality embryos which you expected. So these are groups 1 and 2 of Poseidon, and you have groups 3 and 4, which are young and old patients who to start with have a diminished ovarian reserve. So you are prepared for these patients. They have a low AMH, low FC. You know whatever you give her, she is not going to respond the way you want her to. So simply put, groups 1 and 2, where you thought you will get everything right, but things don't work out well, Number one cause, asynchronous development. And that is why, again, I am stressing on this. Polymorphisms, yes, undertreatment, yes, but asynchrony is what gives you a bad response, especially when you're using the antagonist protocol in a in a lot of normal responders who then get subgrouped into group 1 and 2 of Poseidon. So to go a little bit into detail here is how to pre-treat a patient before you start ovarian stimulation. The first and the simplest is the use of estradiol valerate. Simple, you give 2 milligrams twice a day from day 25 of her cycle. She comes to you during her menstruation. Say she comes on a Monday or a Tuesday. You don't want to start stimulation till Friday. You let her continue the estradiol valerate. The beauty of the estradiol valerate in this dose, don't give TID, you have to give only BID, is it does not stop menstruation. So she will get her menstruation at the correct time. Bleeding will stop because of the estradiol, the endometrium will regenerate. By Friday, you will have your triple line endometrium again, but there is no follicular recruitment. So this dose of estradiol is just right to give the negative feedback to make sure that there is no FSH release endogenously and no recruitment of follicles at this time. So this is how luteal phase estradiol works. Then you then start FSH from Friday, stop the estradiol valerate on Thursday, and you then continue with your stimulation without any problem. The beauty of this, you get a synchronous pool and you don't have one follicle shooting ahead of the others. The second simple way is use of norethisterone. As the Fisher protocol described, you just give norethisterone 5 milligrams twice a day from day 20 if she has a 28-day cycle. Minimum 7 days, maximum 14 days. Stop on any Sunday between the 7th and the 14th day and start stimulation from Friday. Very easy to do. The dose is so small, there is no over suppression, which you normally would get with an OC pill. The best way, which I use very routinely now, because in our clinic like ours, which is almost 365 days, we just need to play 2 or 3 days. So suppose I want to go for a conference next weekend. She comes on Monday, which is her day 2. I don't need to give her norethisterone, OC pills or estradiol. I just give her the antagonist on day 2, 3 and 4. So just 3 shots and start stimulation from day 5. So you just give day 2, 3, 4 antagonist, which will make sure that there is no follicular dominance. Plus you have pushed her cycle by 3 days. You start FSH or HMG from Friday and you go for your conference and come back and do the egg retrieval. So this really works well and is excellent, not only for this category, but also for another category of patients now where progesterone level on day 2 is high. We know about progesterone level being high on day of HCG not being too good for results. Now there is a new addition that day 2 progesterone being more than 1.5 also is not good for the final outcome. So in that group 2, you can just have to give antagonist on day 2, 3, 4 and start stimulation from day 5. Why no to OC pills? You can see very clearly here in Grissinger's classic meta-analysis. Ongoing pregnancy rates are lower when you use OC pills. Duration of stimulation is too long. Gonadotropin consumption is excessive. Number of oocytes not as many as you would have got without the OC pill. Of course, there is a new paper now just released 2 months ago where they say that if you give just 10 days of the OC pill, it may be as efficacious as estradiol or norethisterone without the adverse effects of prolonged OC pill. The other commonest phone call I get is for egg donors. A lot of gynecologists call me that in egg donors with agonist trigger, they don't get the number of eggs they expected, or they don't get the number of metaphase 2 eggs that they expected. The biggest problem here is that most of the egg donors in India are already on OC pills being put by their agent so that they can be rushed between clinics and to make it flexible that they can start stimulation whenever a clinic wants a donor. All they do is tell the donor, okay, stop the OC pill, get your period and start. The problem here is that most of these are high responders. Most of them will need an agonist trigger. Now with the HCG trigger, they won't have any problem, but with an agonist trigger where you need endogenous FSH-LH to be released, the higher the suppression of LH, you can see here, the higher the suppression of LH, which OC pill will do at the start of stimulation, the higher the percentage of a suboptimal response. Now, this is the biggest problem here. You have to make sure that the donors are not taking OC pills. Either you give them instructions for estradiol valerate, or like our clinic does on a walk-in basis, we don't manipulate any of their cycles. They walk in on their regular day 2. If I need to manipulate 2-3 days, I give the antagonist day 2, day 3, day 4, and start stimulation from day 5. If you give OC pills, you are not going to get an ideal as you would. And the commonest question they ask is that in my patients with agonist trigger, I don't have this problem. But with donors, I have this problem. And this is the reason that they are all taking OC pills. They have excessive suppression of LH at the start of stimulation, and which is why you get a suboptimal response. Then, of course, my favorite topic, and that is whether agonist is better or antagonist better for poor responders. We always thought that, oh, and a poor responder is already suppressed. She doesn't have enough follicles. Now you're using down regulation. You are suppressing her even more. Even those 2 eggs we will not get. It's the contrary. You can see here this large paper which clearly shows that when you use the agonist, you get a greater number of oocytes, more embryos, and much higher clinical pregnancy rates. And we did our own beautiful study here, the best control study you can possibly do. The same patient, 36 patients, first cycle, they all took the antagonist. Second cycle, they all took the agonist. All were potential poor responders. So they were 27 to 41, most of them between 32 and 36 with low AMH. 50% of these patients had an AMH of less than 1. And you can see very clearly the number of top quality embryos. And this is very important slide because these are the ones which finally give you the viable pregnancy. In these poor responder groups with the antagonist, the number of top quality embryos were just 17.5%. And this doubles when you use the agonist. So you're getting a much higher proportion, 33 to 35% of top quality embryos with agonist as compared to the antagonist. So this is very important point here. Even if you look at poor quality embryos, 38% with the agonist, 65% with the antagonist. So in the poor responder, please remember that why we discontinued the agonist cycles and long protocols because of hyperstimulation. That in normal and high responders, you get too many eggs. But isn't that what you want in a poor responder? In a poor responder, you want more eggs. Even if you get 2 more eggs, it is going to give you a much better outcome. I know a lot of you will be wondering, what is he saying? How can 2 eggs make a difference? I'll show you how even 1 egg will make a difference to the success rate. So what about increasing FSH doses? Now, poor responders in the second cycle, you don't need to jump from 150 to 450. All you need to do is increase the dose by 50 to 75. And you can see here, when you increase from just 75 IU, you get a much better and higher number of oocytes in the subsequent cycle. And this is what I meant when I told you that what does 1 extra oocyte mean? Just look at this slide. With 1 oocyte, live birth rates are around 4%, 2 oocytes, 9%, 13%, 17%, and so on. So with every additional oocyte that you get, you will have a much higher pregnancy rate for that patient. So each oocyte is important, and that is why the agonist cycle scores over the antagonist in poor responders. What about groups 3 and 4? These are patients, young and old, where you know they don't have enough eggs. So any amount of FSH is not going to work. Again here, agonist does much better than the antagonist. This is a very recent publication from 2018, where clearly for Poseidon group 3, again, you can see a doubling of the pregnancy rate with the use of the agonist as compared to the antagonist. What about maximum doses? The most important take-home point here, I'm sure most of the gynecologists everywhere use 450 for this group of patients. Oh, AMH is low, AFC is low, let's give 450. The biggest thing I'm going to tell you right now is that it doesn't work. Whether you give 300 or 450 or 600, your live birth rate is the same. And current recommendation is that these patients don't have follicles. They don't need such high doses. Just 150 is enough for stage 3 and stage 4 Poseidon. So you don't need to go above 150. So in groups 1 and 2, maximum dose you go up to is 300. If you had given 150, you can go up to 300, 225, you can go to 300. In stage groups 3 and 4, 150 is the max. Going beyond that is not going to manufacture new follicles because she doesn't have those follicles to be recruited. So very important. And lastly, of course, before we finish, something I'm really excited about, and that is dual stimulation. And just in brief, I don't want to go too much in detail. We all know that every woman has multiple waves of follicular recruitment. So you can see 68% of women have 2 waves of follicular recruitment. And the whole idea of dual stimulation is that we start FSH LH from day 2 of the cycle as usual. It has to be an antagonist cycle. Don't give HCG trigger, give the agonist trigger, do the egg retrieval. After 3 days, again start stimulation. So you don't wait for menstruation. You immediately start stimulation again, and that is called follicular phase stimulation in the first half, and luteal phase stimulation is the second half. Now, what is the logic? you can see here that the rate of patients obtaining one euploid blastocyst increases from 42% to 65% with the contribution of luteal phase. So it is not that you are in a hurry and you want to keep stimulating her. You get better quality oocytes and better quality embryos somehow in the second half of the menstrual cycle with luteal phase stimulation. Very, very important breakthrough. We have almost done around 25 patients now. Of course, before the virus attack, we almost were so upbeat and ready to start transferring them, but I'm hopeful that we'll transfer. But just seeing and comparing number of oocytes between follicular phase and luteal phase, number of top quality embryos between follicular and luteal phase, the luteal phase is doing fantastic. And this may be a big ray of hope for a lot of poor responders who just don't want egg donation. What about LH supplementation? Of course, we know all elderly women should be given LH from day one. Hypo responders, first cycle, if you find out she's a hypo responder, means she goes very slow and the follicles are stagnant. You can give it from day one in the next cycle. In this current cycle, you could add HMG from day 6 or day 7. All patients of hypo, that is hypogonadotropic hypogonadism, obviously you have to begin with 300 IU of HMG, nothing less than that works. Poor responders, until now we thought that addition of LH does not help, but most of the recent data shows that addition of LH does help in poor responders. Which LH to use? Personally, I favor HPHMG, which has HCG driven LH activity. You can see here HCG has a long half-life, so it tends to accumulate. And you can see here as HCG levels increase, the higher the HCG level on day 6, the more the number of top quality embryos that you get. And again, you can see here, if you give just LH, the pregnancy rate, live birth rate remains at around 10% because it doesn't accumulate because of a very short half-life. But if you use HCG driven LH activity, the more it accumulates, the higher your pregnancy rate with the higher the levels of HCG in the system. So this is why we prefer to use HPHMG instead of regular LH. I'll skip these slides. Of course, just the take home message is that DHEA doesn't really work. So it's not, as of now, there is no evidence to support the use of DHEA. What seems to be promising is transdermal testosterone. Of course, most of the available studies were only of 21 days. But the best recommendation, if you actually see physiology, is you need to give at least 60 days. So we are awaiting the results of the T-Transport trial, which has been going on for the last 2 years, where they are giving testosterone gel 0.5 grams a day for 60 days pre-stimulation. And it would be exciting to see how it works. Currently, we are just using the same 21-day pre-stimulation, testosterone gel, and then begin FSH HMG. So we start from day 6 of the preceding cycle to get in the full 20 days. And then from day 2, we discontinue testosterone when you begin your FSH stimulation. Trigger, we prefer to use the dual trigger, that is both HCG as well as 0.2 milligrams of triptorelin for poor and normal responders. High responders, of course, I told you, you cannot give HCG. You have to only use the agonist trigger. You get much more higher number of oocytes. You can see with dual trigger, 7 oocytes as against 2 with the conventional HCG trigger and so on, much higher number of top quality embryos. Also, if you don't get enough metaphase 2 oocytes in a lot of 2 patients, means you get 10 eggs, but only 2 metaphase 2. Again, the dual trigger will work much better. You can see number of metaphase 2 oocytes increases from 3 to almost doubling at 6. So the dual trigger is the way forward, and you need to use this to get maximum. Again, as I told you, every oocyte is important. And again, as you see this paper, especially in poor responders, when you use a dual trigger, you have a much higher clinical pregnancy rate at 33% as against 20% with the use of HCG alone. So currently, what is my choice for poor responders? We give 2 months of pre-treatment with coenzyme Q and resveratrol, testosterone gel for 20 days. First choice protocol is long agonist protocol with HPHMG. Second choice, pre-treatment, again, most important in an antagonist cycle, either with estradiol or norethisterone or the antagonist. Stimulation, your choice, REC-FSH or HPHMG. In an antagonist cycle, always a dual trigger. Dual stimulation, that is luteal phase stimulation, might soon become first choice once I complete the trial of about 30-40 patients and see the pregnancy rates. Fresh embryo transfer if progesterone levels are not ideal. And of course, frozen embryo transfer and embryo accumulation finally works the best for these patients. What about embryo transfer? No lecture on ovarian stimulation will be complete without achieving the live birth. We know that 65% of IVF cycles in fresh transfers do not give you a pregnancy because of supraphysiologic levels of estradiol and so on, which is why freeze-all came into being. And now freeze-all is not just for high responders. for all these categories of patients. So in our clinic, any patient who has a low or a high progesterone, or a previous biochemical pregnancy, or a previous miscarriage, previous ectopic pregnancy, poor responder undergoing embryo accumulation, patients of endometriosis where we know it's better to downregulate and transfer, not downregulate for the egg retrieval, contrary to what we were taught before. When there is a need for PGS, of course, the results take a week, so you need to do a frozen transfer. Suppose during the follicular phase, you see a polyp which you had not seen earlier and you need to remove it. PCOS, of course, without fail, you have to do a freeze-all. Patients of thin endometrium where you want to do GCSF, PRP and all those treatments, and patients of repeated IVF failures with fresh transfer. So in a clinic like ours, where 90% of patients are those who have failed IVF somewhere in the world, most of them fall under these categories, which is why we switched to a freeze-all policy. We are very happy with the results. You can see here consistently 50 to 60% pregnancy rate, almost on par with the egg donation and the embryo donation categories, which shows how important endometrial receptivity is. So if you have top quality embryos, own eggs will give you the same success rate as egg donation if you do frozen embryo transfer. What is the cutoff? This study, classic study, showed that below 10 eggs, fresh and frozen have the same results. Above 10 eggs, 10 to 15, frozen is much better. You can see here frozen pregnancy rates are much higher. Is lucky 13 actually the magic number? A very recent paper by the same group and Polizos shows that 13 oocytes is the cutoff between fresh and frozen transfer. And finally, to conclude, we know that ovarian stimulation aims to collect multiple good quality oocytes. Poor response will be associated with disappointingly low pregnancy rates. Excessive response will increase your risk of OHSS. Higher number of eggs retrieved is associated with a higher number of good quality embryos. In turn, gives you higher cumulative pregnancy rates. Higher number of oocytes retrieved also results frequently in elevated premature progesterone, which detrimentally affects pregnancy rates in fresh transfers. Individualizing stimulation strategies is the answer to optimize your outcomes. You can use urinary or recombinant gonadotropins. Of course, we know the drawbacks of urinary gonadotropins, purity, batch-to-batch consistency, and so on. AFC and AMH are the best and strongest predictors of ovarian response and will help you to predict the potential high responder. Very important. So you use the antagonist for her and not the agonist. Poor responders, remember you cannot stimulate eggs which are not existent. So going high with your dosage doesn't help. Ensuring a proper FSH starting dose is the most crucial part of a successful IVF cycle. Doses of more than 300 should be avoided for any category of patients. Increasing or decreasing the doses on day 7 doesn't work. No convincing evidence on the value of adjuvants like DHEA, aspirins, testosterone, growth hormones, and so on. Dual stimulation seems to be promising, but we still don't have enough RCTs. Normal responder, try to maximize the number of oocytes without compromising endometrial receptivity. Personally, I feel 225 is probably the best dose for normal responders. High responders, only antagonist, never use the agonist cycle. Proper FSH starting dose so that you get good number of good quality metaphase 2 oocytes. Only agonist trigger, only freeze-all so that you get very high live birth rates. So please, to summarize then, pre-treatment strategies, very important to get your uniform cohort. Starting day of stimulation, very important because you have to get the correct dose for the correct patient. You also have to control the LH surge. And finally, freeze-all is a real big revolution for improving IVF success rates. Once again, thank you, Dr. Harshad Parasnis, Ashwini, Dr. Chaitanya, entire POGS for this opportunity. And I'm not sure whether we have, we have.
Yeah, Jatin, we can have some time.
Yeah,
Yes,
we can have questions, sir, because there are many questions waiting for
I
you.
think,
Yeah, no problem.
yeah. Jatin, excellent overview of the subject. I think Ashwini, I can see a lot of questions that have come up.
Yeah. Thank you so much, sir. We didn't realize that we actually were listening to you for 1 hour 40 minutes. It was an excellent talk.
No. We started at 1 hour 20 minutes. We started
1 hour 20 minutes.
1
It
hour
was
20
super.
minutes. Yeah.
So we'll start with the questions. They want to know,
Ashwini.
what do you give? Yes, sir.
Yeah, I just want to have one question to him.
Yeah, I'll first take the questions and then maybe you can take. Is that fine?
Fine.
Yeah. So we'll start with the first question where they want to know, how do you start with the pre-treatment with norethisterone?
Yeah, so norethisterone, I told you, you give twice a day from day 20 of the previous cycle. You can give minimum 7 days, maximum 14, sometimes even 20 days. You can stop on any Sunday between the 7th and the 14th day. That is if you want to start stimulation on Friday. So there is a 4 to 5 day waiting period. Usually she will menstruate on a Thursday. Friday would be day 2 and you could begin the stimulation on that day. So it's very easy to do. Norethistérone is not very difficult. Estradiol valerate, you have to remember that you can only push till day 9. So you can't go on pulling on estradiol valerate. If Monday was day 1, you can push to say the next Monday, then she would be day 8 or day 9. Beyond that, you might have follicular dominance. Antagonist pre-treatment, just day 2, 3, 4 or day 5 also you can add depending on how many days you want to push it. If you use OC pill, you start from day 2, don't give more than 10 days. So stop within 10 days and 5 days after the last pill, you start the stimulation. So these are the 4 best ways of pre-treatment as of now.
Okay, and how do you check for FSH and LH polymorphisms, sir?
There are tests which are available with Gene Explorer. They are easily available now. So it's, and the incidence is coming quite to 16 to 18% for the Indian population. So it's worthwhile doing it because then you know, okay, this patient needs HMG from the beginning. You should not give her FSH alone. Plus you are prepared that she's going to be a hyporesponder. So she may drop out if you are doing a batch IVF. So it gives you a lot of information before you start.
Okay. Sir, in your antagonist cycle pre-treatment, is it possible to do a fresh embryo transfer?
Yes, you can, of course. So if you have less than 13 oocytes,
Okay.
if you have less than 13 oocytes, if your progesterone on the day of HCG is more than 0.5 and less than 1.5, you have a good endometrium, you can get the same pregnancy rate whether you do fresh or frozen embryo transfer.
Right. So, and if we get a suboptimal response in Poseidon criteria 1 and 2, can we add LH at that time?
You can add LH, but increasing the dose won't work. So if you are giving FSH 225, you can switch to HMG 225, or you can add Rec LH, maybe 150 IU, because the total dose of FSH is what is to be counted. And so you don't need to step up the units. Units remain the same, but you can definitely switch from FSH to HMG because those with V beta LH receptor polymorphisms will definitely respond when you change to LH on that day.
Okay. So, and do you do E2 levels in your FET cycles?
I don't do any levels anytime during the cycle except a beta HCG to confirm a pregnancy. So that is, of course, with experience, you don't need to do all these estimations. But the only estimation we do is progesterone on day of HCG if we are planning a fresh transfer. Like I told you, 95% of our patients go for frozen, so we don't really need to. E2 would only help you if you want to cancel a cycle. Suppose you want to take a decision on that she's on an agonist and, and she's may go into ovarian hyperstimulation, then E2 cutoff and maybe 3,500, 4,000 plus, you might want to cancel or convert to a freezol or whatever.
Okay. So, is any experience about using dydrogesterone for preventing premature LH surge?
No, so right now they have used MPA. The only RCT which is available is using medroxyprogesterone to prevent the LH surge, but they don't know the effects on the offspring. So we are waiting for that data. And when you have so many good options, I don't really see the point of pursuing it further. Dydrogesterone, yes, sounds better because we give it during pregnancy anyway. So let's see how it works. I have not used it personally, but they are saying that it is, of course, it has 100% efficacy as far as preventing the LH surge goes. But again, whether it is superior to the antagonist, I'm not sure.
Okay. Chaitanya, you want to take your question?
Yes. Sir, I just wanted to know that you said that almost 25% of the patients with PCOS for IUI have got premature luteinization, and therefore we are going to add antagonist in these patients.
Yeah.
So do you add antagonist for all your patients from the beginning when you start with the stimulation for all the PCOS patients, or only if she shows luteinized unruptured follicle, or do you do progesterone levels on the day of trigger or something to know whether she is, prematurely luteinized?
Good question. Now the only thing is you can't do anything in that cycle. If once she goes into LUF, you can't do anything to rescue that cycle is gone. So if you have a history of a previous cycle which you've done where she had an LUF, then it is best to give antagonists from the time the follicle turns 14 millimeters in diameter. But as a blanket rule, especially in your learning stage, I would recommend that whenever you use gonadotropins, because the main chunk of expenditure is on the gonadotropin, antagonist is relatively not as costly as the gonadotropin per se. So it doesn't really add to cycle cost. So I would strongly recommend that for PCO, use the antagonist whenever you're using gonadotropins, especially in doses of 112 or 150. If you're spending so much, you don't want 1 in 4 to you then have a LUF. So it's best to use the antagonist and fine tune that particular patient. So strongly recommended, yes, you should use the antagonist.
Thank you.
Ashwini, this is
Yes.
Dr. Mamta. Can you allow me a question?
Yeah, sure, Dr. Mamta.
Jatin, hi. Good evening. Excellent as usual. Mamta here.
Oh, you are an
Jatin,
IVF specialist.
I had a quick question for you
Yeah.
about this new guidelines that don't use gonadotropins for unexplained infertility. Is it because of the worry of increased multiple pregnancies, or is it because it does not increase pregnancy rates by using gonadotropins?
Yeah.
Because if we look at the logic, it is that in an anovulation, because the patient is not ovulating, you just have to achieve ovulation and then do an IUI, whereas in unexplained the patient is already ovulating. So
Exactly.
just by giving her a tablet to cause just a single follicle, of course with CC it's different, then why not use the gonadotropins in unexplained infertility?
so the
Only
whole
to
logic-
prevent.
Yeah. No, so the whole logic now is that using gonadotropins in unexplained infertility, the pregnancy rate is not higher than using 3 cycles of clomiphene or letrozole with IUI. So if you've already done those 3 cycles, then 3 cycles of gonadotropins will not give you as much a result at the cost of a very high multiple pregnancy rate. And the time to pregnancy will be much shorter with 1 cycle of IVF. So that is what all the RCTs put together are now showing. So I
No,
think
but-
go through that
but-
because it's a very detailed analysis. It's a huge document. I couldn't put all that into this.
Yeah.
But, it's really worth going through because it came as a shock to me also. Because even as I admitted, I still use gonadotropins for all patients.
Right.
So
Because if a patient comes to us, I think we would automatically not give her 3 cycles for an unexplained, not give her 3 cycles of CC and then wait for gonadotropin. We would just directly put her on a CC gonadotropin or only gonadotropin. So it's not that we're giving her 6 cycles. So why not use it is my question. Somehow
no, so
I'm
that
not...
is what they are saying. The pregnancy rate is not superior to 3 cycles of CC-IUI. That is the whole point they're making. And you are increasing the pregnancy rate significantly.
Okay. All right.
Thank you, Dr.
Thanks
Mamta.
so much. Excellent. Thanks, Ashwini. Thank you for...
Welcome.
So we want to know, do you do level of progesterone on the day of embryo transfer in FETs?
Yeah, now this is a very good question and it is a burning topic. The only thing is now there is some misconceptions there because they say if the progesterone on the day of transfer is less than 9, then you should
Less than point.
and not do the transfer. So the ideal level should be 15-20. Now the whole problem is if you go through the monographs, this is what I feel, of vaginal progesterone, and all these papers are using either a gel or a micronized vaginal progesterone and not intramuscular progesterone.
Right.
It doesn't reflect too well in serum levels. So this is now a very contradictory point that if it doesn't reflect well in serum levels, how can you have a 9 as a cutoff? Because we don't know whether the endometrium has received enough progesterone or not. So this is still a gray area. There is one strong paper that says less than 9 don't do transfer. But just recently at I think Chennai, Mahabalipuram, we had Dracopoulos and Polizos both. So they both
they take a level of 11 to 15, I think.
So they gave the same point that vaginal progesterone may not accurately reflect in this.
Okay. Thank you, sir. So there's one more question. You said processed sperm survive only for 2 hours. So is there no role for a double IUI?
No, there is absolutely no role for double IUI. And if you go through the ASRM recommendations, which I just mentioned, they are clearly saying that one IUI between 0 and 40 hours post HCG. Now, this is contradictory to what I showed about the timing, is giving the same success rate. So whether you do it at the time of HCG or you do it at 40 hours or any time in between, single IUI, never double IUI, you will get the same pregnancy rate.
Okay. So what about the dual trigger? You give it in all patients?
Yeah, dual trigger is given for all patients, except of course high responders you can't. High responders you have to give only agonist trigger because HCG will result in
dosage.
Right,
So
dosage, sir.
Somebody was asking for dosage.
Yeah, so 6,500 IU of HCG, 6,500 IU of rec HCG and 0.2 milligrams of triptorelin. So this is given at 36 hours for all normal responders. For poor responders, there is recommendation that you give the agonist at minus 40 and you give the HCG at 34, not 36 hours.
Sir, have you come across any patients for PCOS when we are stimulating them and we have say 20-22 follicles which are of good size and we give agonist trigger? The number of M2s which we get are as less as compared to if we give HCG trigger.
Sorry, I didn't get that.
Okay.
Can you repeat the question?
a PCOS patient who has been stimulated, and I get around 20 follicles on ultrasound,
Yeah.
and I give an agonist trigger because she is likely to hyperstimulate.
Yes, correct.
In such patients, do you get the number which is seen on ultrasound and the number of M2s which we actually get after oocyte retrieval? Is there a difference between the two? And I find that if you are giving agonist trigger, the number of M2s which we get are less than as compared to an HCG trigger.
Exactly. Now just go back and check whether you gave OC pill to that patient. That is exactly the slide I was showing. That a lot of PCOS patients have taken OC pills, and this is the exact reason then why you don't get enough. If you have not used OC pill pre-treatment, you will have the same result as an HCG
But
trigger.
as you rightly said, most
oocyte,
of these patients,
same.
yes, as you rightly said, most of these patients are donors.
OC pill. Yeah. So they have all taken some suppression in the past, so their LH levels are very low at the beginning. So agonist
They don't-
needs good endogenous LH level. Otherwise, you will not get a good surge.
And they don't tell us.
Yeah, donors never tell. It took us 6 months to sort out this problem. For almost 6 months to 1 year, I was wondering that why my patients of PCOS with agonist trigger give excellent metaphase 2 and embryos, and why donors don't give.
No,
We changed
there are
everything.
times also, sir, when you don't get any follicles on the day of your pickup also.
To be honest, my question is answered today. I was also having this question in my mind for so many months. Ki why is this happening? And I was not able to figure it out.
You stop the pill and you see the difference. My life changed from that day. Because at 6 months we were really
I know.
only with donors. All donors.
Exactly, only with donors. Exactly.
And I blamed all the companies that your Cetro is not good, your FSH is not good, HMG is not good. Finally,
Absolutely, and it's very difficult, to when we have spent so much of the
Nobody highlighted
efforts on the
lectures.
donor,
It was
money and everything, and you get number which is not as per your expectation, you get frustrated at the end of the day.
Of course, definitely.
Right.
I think
So-
Ashwini,
I think, I think we should stop the
Stop.
questions now.
yeah. I mean, it is amazing that we have been listening to him and he has presented to us more than 150 slides, and we all engrossed listening to him.
So good you told me in the
Absolutely.
beginning, okay, you have 2 hours.
Yes, yes.
Where will I get a chance like
But
this?
excellent talk, Jatin. I must say, excellent talk.
Excellent.
Thank you.
Excellent.
We would also not get this time to get all our queries answered.
Yeah, because
Thank you
normally
so
in the
much,
conference they give you 15 minutes, 20 minutes.
I know.
5 parallel
Yes,
calls,
yes.
घंटी बजाने का. So thank all
So
of
this-
you. Thank you so much.
I mean, we had a record of almost 450 plus people logging in. And
it's my
thank you
record
so
of the
much.
longest lecture ever. So thank you.
Nice. We'll put up this lecture on our POJ's website soon.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, sir.
Thank you so much.
Thank
sir.
you.
Thank you, Harsh.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jatin. Yeah.
Thank you. ऊपर से
So you just have to end or leave the meeting from above. It's at the right of your screen,
Yeah.
right top.
Yeah.
Okay, sir.